Thank you. Next up, please welcome Megan Brown, the Chair of Privacy, Cyber, and Data Governance at Wiley, Rein, LLP, and our panelists, Kemba Walden, President of Paladin Global Institute, Brett Leatherman, Assistant Director of FBI Cyber Division, Sandra Joyce, Vice President of Google Threat Intelligence, and Morgan Adamski, U.S. Cyber Leader at PwC and the former Executive Director of U.S. Cyber Command.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. I won't have to go through introductions, but I did want to level set. You guys have the great good fortune of having such a well-experienced and diversely experienced set of folks to talk about the topic of the day, which is offensive cyber. It's a project that Aspen Digital has been pushing forward. Kemba is co-director of the Aspen Digital Cybersecurity Working Group, and they've been pulling together folks to think about really some themes that pull on the conversation we all just listened to about how to change incentives. So we're going to dive in, a lot of ground to cover in only 40 minutes, and I really do believe in trying to stay on time. So just to orient folks, if you haven't gone to the website and kind of started to poke around some of the Aspen papers and thought pieces that have been put out, I would just give a little flavor. The stated goal of Aspen's project on offensive cyber is to stimulate debate on a newer whole-of-government approach to offensive cyber operations and what that might look like. And the thesis is that this focus on defense that I think you heard Director Karen Cross and Kevin talking about as well, is that threat actors have little consequence for their campaigns. They keep attacking critical infrastructure, and maybe now there is a desire to try and shift those incentives and to not just impede the effectiveness of their attacks, but ratchet up the consequences. So with that, I thought I would toss the first question to Kemba, which is, can you kind of help the audience really appreciate what we actually mean by offensive cyber operations, and maybe touch on some of the practical and maybe legal limits on those operations?
Sure. Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Aspen, for having me here. Like Megan mentioned, I am one of the co-chairs for Aspen Digital US, and one of the projects that we're working on is called Project Disruption. We have a whole host of thoughtful pieces that are not white papers, Director Karen Cross, but are short, digestible pieces. And I thought I'd start with Megan's question, which is to sort of frame the taxonomy, what we mean by cyber defense, active defense, and offense. Words matter, so I've written some of them down on a card. Usually I don't speak from cards, but they matter now. When we talk about these terms, we need to sort of think in a framework. We think about our infrastructure, the internal infrastructure that we control as enterprises, as governments, and we think about the external infrastructure, things that we don't control, but we take the fight there. So when we talk about internal structures, we're talking about cyber defense. And that's in the form of passive defense, which is all the cyber hygiene things that we've been talking about for decades. We can talk about active defense, which is a little bit more aggressive. So things like threat hunting comes to mind, vulnerability scanning, things that the Digital Crimes Unit at Microsoft does, that Cloudflare, or I think it's called Cloud Force One, does in protecting its own infrastructure. But then we can talk about external work, right? What are the offensive actions that we take, and how do we think about them? We have to think about them in terms of effects, and there are 4 effects I'm going to take you through, and here's where the words matter. They range from minimal effects to severe effects. Minimal effects mean things like cyber scanning and cyber intrusions. Cyber intrusions coming into your network unauthorized, without permission, is still a crime, but there are minimal effects for just coming in. For informational effects, we're talking about things like information collection, espionage, the things that Salt Typhoon are doing in our systems right now. Cyber information dissemination, so you have collection and then you have dissemination, sort of information operations for those of you in those spaces. But then we have disruptive or damaging effects. That's when you take the fight outside of your network. The FBI has done a great job, for example, using Rule 41, doing that, when they went after Sandworm, and I assume there's some other campaigns that you've done. Denial of service attacks, like the Mirai botnet, if you remember those things in the Internet of Things. And then cyber sabotage, like Volt Typhoon, or wiper malware, where it's destructive in nature and not necessarily collection in nature. And then we have cyber offensive operations that have potentially lethal effects, and those are the things that are authorized through Title 10, which is military intelligence, or Title 32, which is National Guard, Title 50, national defense. But those are things that have severe consequences. So there's a whole range of cyber operational effects. Aspen has produced some papers around these concepts, starting with that taxonomy framing that I just described, then moving on to a deterrence conversation that Joyce published online. And that deterrence, the foundational piece of that is that passive and active defense that I described earlier. So I would go through all of that. We talk about credible, proportional, and persistence in deterrence policy. And you heard Director Karen Cross talk about a deterrence policy in this America First policy. We also have a paper by John Carlin that is on hackback, what industry can and can't do, looking through the Cyber Fraud and Abuse Act and what industry can and can't do. I think one of the papers talks about CISA 2015, because you'd asked for legal frameworks, I can't help it, and sort of how do we think about taking more aggressive defensive measures, monitoring your own network for a cybersecurity purpose. And then we have Mark Montgomery's written a paper on cyber force, that cyber offensive action in the Title 10, 32, and Title 50 spaces. And then we'll have a closing paper that'll come up on letters of marque. For all of those that are curious, it's fascinating. But you'll read it again in another decade, you'll read it again in another decade, understand it, and then dismiss it as an idea. So with that, words matter. So we have internal network effects, which is protective in the passive and aggressive space. We have external to your network, taking the fight external. So those are cyber offenses that have effects that range from minimal and severe. And then we have cyber offense in those spaces, deterrence, and other policy matters. Did I cover the waterfront?
Thank you. Yes, that's great. And you can follow up online to do a dive into each of those papers. To pick up on something Kemba said and then throw my next question to Brett from the FBI, a lot of the challenge with offensive cyber operations, and when she talks about hackback and the paper that John Carlin wrote, is a lot of these the legal authorities to take these kinds of actions outside of networks or that have these other effects, they are, many think, the exclusive power of the sovereign, right? That is a nation state type of activity. At least here in the United States, there's legal barriers to taking some of those actions. And I'm curious, Brett, if you could kind of share your perspective on this whole topic of offensive cyber operations. The FBI is one of the wielders of those sovereign powers to take some of these actions. So I'm curious for your perspective. Great partner, obviously, to protect victims of cyber attacks, using your authorities creatively, but how do you approach the whole concept of offensive cyber, and are you nervous about a looser approach to offensive cyber?
Yeah, you have to wield it responsibly, right? And so that's why it's in the power of the sovereign. It's the country that should be conducting those operations, because it's executives within the government who are taking on the risk calculus of conducting those operations. Here in the US, it's illegal for a private sector company to hack back. We know that. It's a violation of 18 US Code 1030, which is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It's an attack on the confidentiality, the integrity, or the availability of even adversary infrastructure, right? And so in the FBI, at US Cyber Command, and beyond, like, we in the government take that charge seriously, because when Sean talks about shifting the burden to the adversary, that equals imposing cost on the adversary, and there are few agencies that can do that, the FBI being one. We approach that through what we call joint sequenced operations, that is joining our capabilities, our visibility, and our authorities with those of our domestic and international partners to sequence those authorities against the actors to have a more enduring impact against the adversary. Now that could look like joining indictments, arrests of individuals themselves with infrastructure takedowns or seizures of cryptocurrency, seizures of online infrastructure, outing malware or tools that those actors use. We do that a lot with CISA and NSA through our joint cybersecurity advisories that we put out there. There's a defense component of our offense operations. What we learn through that offensive work, we have to share that with industry. So after that action happens, industry can collectively raise resilience here domestically against those actors. Those actors, we remove the attack surface from them. Those joint sequenced operations have real impact. Right now, for example, when we pair some of our online technical authorities with enforcement action is an example of that. We have about 6 cyber fugitives sitting in custody in Italy right now due to increased partnerships with our international partners. One of those individuals is Zhu Zhuwei, who is a PRC national who was responsible for, or partly responsible for, the Hafnium hack, allegedly back in 2020 timeframe, which was an attack on Microsoft on-premises exchange servers by the Chinese Communist Party. That is a nation-state taking offensive operations against the U.S. In order to deter the actors from doing that, our goal is to get them in custody and bring them back to the United States to face justice. Now, that is a primarily law enforcement mission, but again, when we pair that with our ability as a law enforcement agency to pair attacks on adversary infrastructure, confidentiality, integrity, or availability of adversary infrastructure and networks, we remove that infrastructure from the virtual battlefield, and then we bring relief to victims here, whether it's critical infrastructure, government agencies, private sector companies. That's incredibly important. And so all of that work, by the way, is informed by our relationships here with industry and the threat intelligence picture. Victims who come and talk to us during a cyber incident allows us to pivot upstream against those actors when folks talk to us early and often about what they're seeing in their environments.
Well, it's actually a great segue to what I was going to ask Morgan to address. Morgan, you know, you're at Cyber Command, you're an NSA for a long time, and certainly we'll have a perspective on that interagency cooperation that Brett just talked about, these sort of joint efforts across the different agencies to deploy their tools and powers. Now, you're recently running cyber at PwC, so you're still seeing, I think, a lot of the same threats and problems, but from the private sector perspective, how should the private sector approach and think about this whole concept of how to best defend U.S. cyberspace, including potentially offensive operations, and the role of the private sector in that?
Thanks, Megan. So when we talk to companies and clients about how they should be thinking about this around the narrative of offensive cyber operations, we break it down into 3 specific things. The first thing we ask companies to think about, and Kemba did a phenomenal job walking through all of the lexicon and terminology, is what are you already doing from a passive defense perspective, and what should you be doing in active defense? And what that really means is we recently conducted a survey about 3,000 CEOs, CISOs, and said, hey, how much are you investing in proactive measures versus reactionary measures? And we saw that less than 25% were investing in those proactive measures. So what that really translates to, from what Kemba talked about, was that active defense, right? Threat hunting, looking at things like decoys and honeypots. How are they trying to figure out how adversaries are potentially getting in their networks? And that's all within their control. That doesn't mean they should not be investing in those passive defense firewalls and all the things that make us secure, but there needs to be a rebalance of how we're seeing investment from an active defense and a passive defense perspective. That will come into play, which we heard earlier in the fireside chat, when you're talking about a strategy around reshaping adversary behavior, cost imposition. If we're going to be more offensive, we need to empower our companies to think about what's inside their control and how they're going to protect against those threats. The second piece of it that we ask them to think about is just all the dependencies they have in terms of other technology and internet service providers and managed service providers. One of the most powerful collaborations that I saw when I was in the US government is when we saw a specific nation-state adversary conducting an attack against a victim, against a specific company, when we brought in the internet service provider, the managed service provider, the endpoint protection provider, what we saw was this amazing collaboration because everyone had a different piece of the puzzle. And we were able to bring all of those pieces together to say comprehensively what's happening and how do we build that end-to-end mitigation plan to better protect against it. And oh, by the way, the lessons we learned from that, we need to get that out to the broader community. And so that's where I think we need companies to think about, ask your internet service provider, ask your cloud provider, hey, how are you tracking these threats? What are you doing on your end? Is there information you need from me that would potentially make you more effective? That open collaboration is where we've seen a lot of success. And that kind of feeds into the last point, and Brett talked about this. I'm very passionate about the fact that we need information flow to go both ways. Information from victims or targets is extremely valuable when people step up, raise their hand, and say, I've had a problem, I've got specific information that may be helpful. Let me provide that to you in a timely manner. May not mean that I know what you do on the back end, because that may be in the classified environment, but a lot of times, us being able to pull the thread, especially on Chinese actors that are pre-positioning in US critical infrastructure, has come from companies, sectors, and victims who have said, I've got information that's gonna help figure out how we figure out what the whole story is and better protect ourselves. And so that open collaboration, that has to occur constantly. It can't phase off because that's the only way we're gonna figure out what's happening in the future.
Let me just add, in the real world, what that looks like is the response to Salt Typhoon.
Yeah.
And that is a perfect example that what I would categorize as the most significant cyber espionage campaign against the United States on US telecom providers, networks. We would not be where we are in containing and remediating the actors, the PRC's foothold within the telecommunications sector, without victims who came forward and said, we want FBI and other government agency teams working with us to work on that containment activity. And we in the US were able to lead the effort to contain the actors domestically and then alert 80 other countries across the globe as a result of that. We would not be where we are today had the victims not engaged meaningfully and in real time with us and with our partners in the interagency.
Can I have a quick follow-up on that, which is, do you think that there were particular policy conditions that made that possible? And I have in mind here, CISA 2015, we've all been sort of advocating for its reauth, but to what do you attribute that willingness?
Yeah, number one, they have a state actor in their environment and they know they need help beyond probably what they bring to the table. Visibility that only FBI and our interagency partners in the intelligence community can bring to combat that state actor, meaning they can provide us IPs, they can provide us hash values, they can provide us information that we can run through our and our partner holdings and come back to them and say, this is what you may want to look for. This is where you may want to look for that in order to help inform that threat hunt activity. I think we can also provide protections, both under CISA 2015, which is in its renewal phase right now, temporarily. We hope that it gets reauthorized. I know Sean would say the same thing for 10 years, clean reauthorization. We advocate for that in the government here. But I would also say that we can protect that information from our perspective under law enforcement process. And so when victims come to us, we're able to protect that pursuant to our ongoing investigations, serving friendly grand jury subpoenas and other ways to protect the confidentiality of that information. So there's a lot of incentive. There's a lot of outside counsels that maybe in this room who are wondering, how does the FBI protect my information or my organization's information or the information of the companies that I have a relationship with? And what I can say is we do protect that. We take a victim-centric approach, and that's why we bring a lot of value to coming into major breaches, minor breaches, any sort of breach that victims face.
It also just comes down to trust. You can't build trust in a crisis. So building those relationships beforehand, having open collaboration, understanding what your requirements are. One of the first things that we always did when I was at NSA, when we were talking to a potential partner in the defense industrial base, was say, here are our priorities, what are your priorities? That's where you have to start. Because if honestly we don't share the same priorities, it's just gonna look like we're not answering specific people's questions or we don't care about what they're saying. It's just we may not have specific insights, expertise, or collection against that specific topic. And so I think that's a really fundamental part of the conversation.
I just want to pull that thread a little bit and answer the question again on policy initiatives, other than saying CISA 2015 over and over, because that's my favorite
That's
law.
a theme, it's a theme.
But we do, from a policy perspective, one of the things that Brett brought out was that we have to have offense and defense on the field at the same time for any cyber operation to take place. effectively and successfully. But to do that and have a coordinated, orchestrated action, we need operational priorities, cyber operational priorities, national operation priorities. Those are things that, from a policy perspective, the government can sort of put its thumb on the scale and identify for the rest of us, what are the things that we're going after? How are we going to boil the ocean, and how are we going to do that, and when are we going to do it? Sort of identifying, you'd mentioned operational priorities, that sort of, we need a belly button to be able to identify what those are. That would be a good place to start in that policy space.
Well, I want to bring Sandra into the conversation. You've been at Mandiant Google sort of having a sort of bird's eye view, so to speak, of the threat environment and tactics for many years. And I'm curious if you think, based on your observations, is the US government up to this right now, this whole discussion of offensive cyber? And sort of what's your perspective from sitting where you are? And don't look at Brett. And
Well, I wouldn't say it's a bird's eye view. I would say it's more of ground truth, because we're responding to victims every day. We're watching how internal controls to a large extent can do quite a bit, but then you have 0 days where people feel very outmatched. And so I would say this, it's not, if you've been in the circle for a while, you'll run into a government person who will say, oh, industry, they need to be more resilient. And if you talk to somebody in industry, they'll be like, when's the government going to do something, right? So I think we probably need to get a different mental model going. We both need to do more. Industry needs to do more. Government needs to do more, because it's been open season on American businesses and government organizations for way too long. Some of it has to do with our approach. We have collectively decided that government will take the action and industry will share intelligence. That's not going to work. And if it was going to work, it would have worked by now. And it hasn't. In fact, the opposite. We see more ransomware out there. We see more intrusions. We see the problem getting worse. So my take is this: if we're going to do information sharing, it needs to be for a purpose. In the practice of intelligence, you're supposed to be giving intelligence so that decision makers can take an action, right? So what should we be doing? And that, I think the answer there is more of the activity that's been talked about here in active defense and other places. So actually, industry can do quite a bit in this realm. At Google, we've started a disruption unit that is looking at the things that are happening. Perhaps, we'll police our platform for sure, but what more can we do? So we have partners all around the world, and we're doing more of the type of thinking around what piece of this can we affect? Where do we have leverage? Are they using these email addresses? Are they using this infrastructure? These are things that we can affect very directly. And in our campaigns, one thing I would say that would be great from governments around the world is we need speed. Because if we take 6 months to do something thoughtful, that is great, but in 2 weeks, if they're back up and running, that's not going to give the effects that we need. In one case where the Google's disruption unit took action, a government partner of ours just couldn't meet the deadlines, and so we said, well, we appreciate the moral support, but we're going to go ahead and execute then, and maybe you can come and do more in the back end, right? So these are the types of activities we need to do more, and there's plenty that industry can do. If you look at, from a network perspective of how threat actors operate, they might use certificate signing from this company. Maybe when they're doing, using cryptocurrency, they're using this, company here or in that gray space. That when you network out how they're operating, there are plenty of opportunities where industry and private companies can work together to do a coordinated takedown or some other type of disruption. And that is exciting because we can do more if we work together. So the way I look at it, information sharing is great. It's step number one, but we should be sharing information to do something. And if we're not doing anything, then we have to ask ourselves, then why are we even complaining if we're not going to be willing to lean in and do something more? So we have partners all around. We're working with them, and we invite, if you have something in your network or you've learned something about a technique or an abuse that you think can be taken down at the systemic level, and you think Google can help, I'd love to hear from you.
No, that's great. And I think some of what you just said picks up in a bit some of the comments Kevin made about attribution, right, on the previous fireside chat, because a lot of what you're talking about, sort of speed, I've certainly experienced both in working with the government and some of the private sector providers. There's different ways attribution is done. There's different confidence levels. All the threat actors seem to have a slightly different name or convention, but stepping back to the topic of offensive cyber, sort of how challenging is the attribution challenge, and should that be seen as a real impediment to the more offensive, external-facing activities that we were talking about?
I don't think that attribution is an impediment. I do think that threat actors want you to believe that it's so complicated to do attribution and you never really can be sure who's doing what, but I don't buy it. We've been doing attribution pretty well for many years. If it's not us, it's, the government is doing, they know, I'm imagining the government knows exactly who's doing what. They have national assets and they have a pretty good view. Now, I wouldn't give every, eager person, the badge to say, you're great at attribution. Not everyone's great at it, but it's certainly something that is done regularly. And with the visibility that we have in infrastructure, I think it's very doable, and we've been doing it for a while.
If I can just add on to that and pull on a thread that Brett talked about earlier. When you talk about offensive cyber operations, there tends to be two pieces of the puzzle that become critically important. There's the first one is, do we have the technical expertise, the capabilities, and the initial access to be successful, right? That can happen fairly quickly if you bring the right people together to have that conversation. That tends to be slightly a little bit more of the easier work. The second piece of that is the risk discussion that Brett talked about. How do you communicate the risk to policymakers and the right people who are going to make the decision for us to be able to execute those operations in a framework that makes sense? When you talk about attribution, it is right. We've gotten much better at attribution. We have tons of data, tons of information that allows us to make these connect the dots fairly quickly. But there are times, I've been in many discussions when I said, how much more data do you need to know who's behind this? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? Like, do I need a picture of the guy sitting at the computer of his screen actually doing this for me to be able to do it? So I think it becomes a risk tolerance perspective. So if you have an administration or you're forcing a strategy that says, hey, we want to be more active, you've got to have the right policy levers there to make sure that that's actually what we're going to be able to do. So sometimes it's not just the attribution piece or the technical capabilities piece, it's because you've got cyber people who've got to communicate the risk. And quite honestly, at times you're communicating to people that do not have a cyber background. Because we all like to think that cyber is the center of the world, which is fantastic. But it's not necessarily, because you've got to make sure people understand, hey, I'm going to do this, and it's not going to look like what you saw in the movies. It's going to be okay, but here's the outcome I'm trying to achieve. And oh, by the way, I've tested the capability. I can show that this is what's going to occur. Here's potentially the ramifications and the risk. But if you allow me to do this, here's the outcome that's going to be able to be achieved.
I was just going to add on the attribution piece of it. So there's pulling from what Morgan said, there's a lot that industry can do without attribution. You don't necessarily need attribution to take active defense of your own networks. But if we are going to go pursue attribution, this is where it helps to have allies to be able to round out that picture in order to be able to develop a coordinated takedown, the kind that Brett described. National cyber operational priorities require some level of attribution, and that attribution sometimes requires some level of jurisdictional collaboration among allies. But there's a lot that can be done without attribution.
So to pick up on something that Director Cairncross said before, and I think a couple of us, you've touched on it, this is a complicated set of things because there's a lot of cooks in the proverbial kitchen here, right? It's not just the FBI. It's not just Cyber Command. It's not just CISA. Do you have any thoughts about the interagency and how that helps or hurts, and maybe some advice for Director Cairncross about, what to be watching to make this as effective a policy environment to execute on goals?
Yeah, so Sean kind of previewed the cyber strategy for you. Luckily for us, we have seen the entirety of that strategy in the FBI and across the interagency, and we've contributed to that strategy so that Sean's approach and ONCD's approach is we want to take what the SMEs within each of these different disciplines understand and apply that to the strategy in a way that makes it meaningful, actionable, so that after the release of that strategy, we can go down those lines of efforts and really focus on each individual effort, whether it's offensive-based work or defensive-based work. incredibly important. So I think having a strategy like that really does rally the interagency around certain lines of effort. But what I will say is we have got some of the best relationships in the U.S. intelligence community and the law enforcement community than I've ever seen. I'm a 22-year agent of the FBI. I've worked a variety of different violations. Most of my time in the FBI has been dedicated to cyber. My background is cyber. I've never seen the relationships as strong as they are over the last few years, in particular with the U.S. intelligence community and our law enforcement partners. And so it is muscle memory for us to synchronize our visibility and capability against any threat that is impacting the homeland and our response to that, or our efforts to go offensive and remove capacity or capability from the bad actors. NSA, U.S. Cyber Command, CIA, and other partners have folks sitting with my teams directly as liaison officers doing the work every day. I have some of my most capable cyber personnel sitting within those agencies, making sure that every day we are sharing intelligence and information that lends itself to attribution, that lends itself to victim notification. And that's an important aspect of this, is it's not just about offensive operations, it's about the intelligence that the U.S. government gets. And maybe we can't put it out there broadly, but we see very specific targeting of a piece of critical infrastructure or an individual or a corporation, and that we get out there and act with urgency in how we address it. I think it was it Kevin that talked about just this need for increased urgency? And I will say that within the interagency, we do still have that sense of urgency. Our concern is that the public does not always see what the CCP is doing, because a lot of it is happening behind the scenes. So us trying to attribute that activity, release it publicly, we hope helps the public understand a little bit of what we see and the urgency behind countering that activity, pre-2027 or beyond.
And I would give this, if we don't include industry, cloud providers who own the majority of critical infrastructure, we will fail. So if it's just a mentality of government only, which I don't think it is, but if we don't make industry our closest partner, we will not succeed.
We talked about China, right? And so I hate to keep harping on it, but that is the elephant in the room right now for many of us. And what I would say is they are using not an all-of-government approach, they're using an all-of-society approach. If you look at Flax Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, we have released public intelligence to say companies within mainland China are providing access to US-based networks, right? And so it takes industry and government to defend those networks domestically.
Yeah, and I would think just what Brett was talking about in terms of the change that's happened in the last couple of years and how we're working, at least in my experience in working in the US government, I think there were two key factors, right? Being able to campaign across multiple fronts using all tools of national power, right? So you're talking about sanctions, indictments, you're talking about disruptive operations, you're talking about defensive mitigation guidance from CISA. Every single agency understood that if we were going to do an action, everyone could have a role, and they stepped up to play that role in that massive campaign. I think the second piece of it is just the great leadership teams across the different US government agencies have realized that the best athlete approach sometimes needs to come into play. Who's equipped, who has the technical expertise, who's there now to create the outcome. It's not just about an authority or who has that direct mission. It's, hey, if we have a best athlete that's going to be able to execute this effectively, I'm going to defer and support them and advocate for them to be able to execute. And I think that's a really different type of mindset shift that has occurred that's been really successful.
You'd asked what advice to give to Sean.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat in Sean's seat for a little bit.
Yep.
And yes, ditto to all of these things, but the other pieces to it are that action plan that he mentioned with the objectives and deliverables, that's important. And then the third piece is the budget, especially across government. A lot of government agencies have unfunded mandates, and that is not helpful. So the action plan is something that industry can plug into. I'm thinking that's going to come out that way, and I have not seen the strategy. But the action plan for agencies to be able to leverage their best superpower to that campaign, and then industry to sort of find a way to fit into that action plan. The government can't direct industry what to do. They can only pass laws to make them not break laws. But then the budget piece of it, maintain partnership with the Office of Management and Budget. I know it's not the sexiest agency in the White House, but it is one of the most powerful agencies. So that would be my additional advice to Sean.
One part of government we have not addressed, because I think it's probably on the other end of energy and action, is the role of Congress. And do you see, we've already touched on reauthorization of CISA information sharing, so I won't go too far down that path, but do you see Congress being additive, helpful, neutral to any of this work on offensive cyber or defense of the homeland right now?
Well, I'm just going to be a lawyer again for a second. So we saw the erosion of Chevron deference. It doesn't exist anymore. And then we saw the major questions doctrine.
Wow, I'm so excited
come
we're
into
talking about
play.
Chevron here.
Sorry, we didn't say AI, so I thought I'd say Chevron.
Oh, you're right.
But so if you want to nerd out on all of that, that means, in sum, that our members of Congress are there to be very specific in legislation that has impact on what the executive branch does. They must be more specific. In order to be more specific, they must understand better what a system looks like, what agentic AI is, what our digital infrastructure looks like. And so the charge for everyone in the room, other than mentioning CISA 2015 as often as we can, is to educate your elected member of Congress at the state level and at the national level as much as you can, so that we have smarter, better rules to be able to execute all the things that Google and PwC and FBI want to be able to execute.
Great. Well, any last thoughts from the other panelists?
No.
Go ahead.
No, I would just, the panel being on offensive cyber. So you've heard now from ONCD that we're going to move forward in that space, right? That is going to be part of the strategy. There's going to be a talk about shaping behavior. There's going to be a talk about cost imposition. I think that we all need to continue to also have the conversation about the importance of having that passive defense, that active defense, that really robust collaboration between industry and government, because as we pick up tempo, it's really important that we're just open and transparent with each other, what we have to be prepared for potentially coming back at us. And I think that's the dialogue that needs to continue to happen.
Now, that's a great note to end on. We're out time, and I really appreciate you guys had this wonderful set of experiences from government, the private sector, the interagency. So thank you for taking the time to join us here, and thank you to Aspen Digital.